I wonder if you've ever felt the world tilt on its axis in a single, silent moment. Not with a bang, or a crash, but with the quiet sound of a deadbolt turning in a lock you no longer have the key to. For me, that moment arrived on a Tuesday in late October, when the air had the crisp, mournful scent of dying leaves. I had just returned from a 2-week trip to the coast, a trip my son, David, and his wife, Sarah, had insisted I take. "You deserve it, Mom," David had said, his hand on my shoulder, a gesture that felt less like affection and more like a placement. "All these years, you've taken care of everyone else. It's time to take care of you." His words were smooth, like polished river stones, and I, fool that I was, had mistaken their smoothness for sincerity. The taxi pulled away from the curb, its engine a receding hum that left behind a profound and unsettling silence. The porch light, a beacon I had kept burning for 30 years, was dark. That was the first prickle of unease. It was a small thing, a forgotten bulb, perhaps. But my husband, Robert, had been meticulous about it. "A light on the porch means home is waiting, Eleanor," he used to say. It's a promise. That promise now felt broken. My luggage stood on the driveway behind me, 2 sensible suitcases filled with neatly folded clothes and tasteless souvenirs. I walked up the 3 steps to the front door, the same steps I had taught David to climb, the same steps Robert had carried me over on our wedding day. And that's when I saw them. Stacked against the siding, just to the left of the door, were my boxes. Not all of my belongings, but a curated collection of my life. My gardening books, the chipped ceramic Robin I'd had since childhood, a box labeled simply photos old, and on top of the highest box, a small, white envelope, stark against the brown cardboard. My name, Mom, was written on the front in David's precise, architectural script. My breath caught in my throat, a tiny, sharp thing. The air grew colder, seeping into my coat. My fingers, numb from the chill, fumbled with the seal. The paper inside was a single sheet, torn from a legal pad. The words were few, but they were heavier than any tombstone. "We've made some changes for the better. It was for your own good. We'll be in touch about the rest. Don't come back, Mom, don't. Come back." Each word was a nail hammered into the coffin of the life I thought I had. I read it again, and then a 3rd time, certain that my mind, weary from travel, was playing a cruel trick. But the ink was steady. The words did not waver. My house, the one Robert and I had built not with just lumber and nails, but with laughter and arguments and whispered dreams, was no longer my home. My belongings, artifacts of a life lived, were curated for disposal. And my son, my only child, the boy whose fevers I had cooled and whose nightmares I had chased away, had evicted me with the sterile finality of a business transaction. I sank down onto the top step, the cold of the concrete seeping through my slacks, and clutched the note. The silence was no longer just the absence of sound. It was a presence. It was the sound of erasure. I looked at the dark windows of my home, and for the first time, I felt like a stranger looking in. The house held its breath, hoarding the warmth and light that had once been mine. It was a fortress now, and I was on the outside. The world hadn't just tilted, it had inverted, leaving me suspended in a cold, silent void, with only a handful of words to tell me I was no longer welcome in my own life. "It was all for my own good," he had written. And in that chilling, paternalistic phrase, I finally began to see the truth that had been hiding in plain sight for years. A truth cloaked in smiles and helpful suggestions and gestures of manufactured concern. I don't know how long I sat there, on that cold step, the paper growing damp in my hand. Time seemed to have dissolved, leaving only the sharp edges of the present moment. Eventually, a shiver that had nothing to do with the October air finally broke the spell. It was the body's wisdom, its primal command to move, to survive. Getting back into a taxi felt like a surrender, a quiet admission that the note was not a nightmare from which I would awake. As the car pulled away, I didn't look back. I couldn't. To see the dark house receding would be to acknowledge the finality of it, and I wasn't ready for that. I needed a buffer, a sterile space where the past couldn't reach me. I told the driver to take me to the first decent-looking motel we passed. The room he left me in was aggressively anonymous. The art on the wall was a generic seascape, the carpet was a swirl of brown and gold, and the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and despair. It was perfect. Here, I was no one. Not a mother, not a widow, not a homeowner. Just a woman with 2 suitcases, and a piece of paper that had detonated her world. I laid the note on the bedside table, smoothing out the creases. It was for your own good, the phrase began to echo in the quiet room, a mocking chorus. And with that echo came the memories, no longer soft and sepia-toned, but sharp and clinical, as if I were reviewing evidence. I remembered the conversation a few months ago, in my kitchen. The smell of cinnamon and baking apples had filled the air. I was making Robert's favorite pie. Sarah had been watching me, her smile a little too bright. "Eleanor, you're amazing," she'd said, leaning against the counter. "But this house, it's so much for one person. All the upkeep. The stairs. We worry about you," David had chimed in, nodding his agreement. "She's right, Mom. We've been talking. Maybe it's time to think about something more manageable." I had dismissed it then, waved it away with a flour-dusted hand. "Nonsense," I'd chuckled. "This house keeps me young." Every creak and groan is a memory. They had exchanged a look, a fleeting glance I had interpreted as fond exasperation. Now, in the harsh light of the motel room, I saw it for what it was, a strategic assessment. They weren't seeing a home, they were seeing an asset. They weren't seeing a mother, they were seeing a liability. Another memory surfaced. David visiting me with a stack of glossy brochures. "Just to look at, Mom," he'd said, spreading them on the dining room table. They were for retirement communities, places with names like Golden Meadows and Serenity Villas. The pictures showed smiling, silver-haired people playing shuffleboard and taking watercolor classes. "Look, they handle everything. The meals, the cleaning, the finances. It would give you so much freedom. It would give us peace of mind, peace of mind. Theirs, not mine." I had felt a flicker of indignation then, a sense that I was being managed, but I had smothered it. It was easier to believe in their concern than to confront the alternative. It was easier to be the quiet, accommodating mother I had always been. The trip itself, the one I had just returned from, was the final, brilliant move in their campaign. They had framed it as a gift, a reward for a lifetime of service. They'd booked the tickets, packed a small bag for me with exaggerated care, and driven me to the airport. Sarah's hug had been firm, proprietary. "Have a wonderful time, Eleanor. Don't worry about a thing. We'll take care of everything here," and they had. They had taken care of everything. They had used my absence to dismantle my life with cold, quiet efficiency. The boxes on the porch weren't a hasty act of anger, they were the calculated result of a plan. They had sorted my life into what was valuable to them, and what was sentimental detritus, to be dealt with later. The bitterness rose in my throat, hot and acidic. It wasn't just the house. It was the deception. The years of subtle conditioning, of planting seeds of doubt about my own competence. They had been building a narrative, brick by brick, that I was frail, that I was forgetful, that I was a burden who needed to be relieved of her own life for her own good. And I, in my desire for a peaceful family, in my love for my son, had handed them the mortar. I had allowed them to define me, to shrink my world down to a size they found convenient. The woman who had managed a household, raised a child, nursed a dying husband, and balanced the books for 30 years had somehow become, in their eyes, incapable of managing her own front porch light. The motel room was silent, but my mind was screaming. The third day in the motel room began just like the two before it, with the first grey light of dawn filtering through the cheap curtains, revealing the same generic seascape, the same swelled carpet, the same crushing reality. I had barely eaten. Sleep was a shallow, restless state populated by ghosts of conversations and the lingering image of my son's handwriting. I was adrift in a sea of grief and shock, and the shoreline was nowhere in sight. My phone had remained silent on the bedside table. I hadn't reached out to them, and they, true to their word, had not been in touch. The silence was a wall they had built between us, and I was too wounded to even test its strength. On that third morning, as I stared at my own haggard reflection in the dark television screen, a name surfaced from the fog. Margaret. Margaret Shaw. My friend from college, a bond forged over late-night study sessions and cheap coffee. We hadn't seen each other in years, not since Robert's funeral, but our lives had run on parallel tracks. While I had been building a home, she had been building a career as one of the sharpest corporate lawyers in the city before retiring. Margaret was not a woman who dealt in euphemisms. She was direct, pragmatic, and possessed a mind like a steel trap. The thought of calling her was terrifying. It would make it real. To speak the words aloud to someone else would be to give them form and weight. But the alternative, to sit here and slowly dissolve in this anonymous room, was even more terrifying. My hand trembled as I found her number in my old address book, a relic from a life before smartphones. I dialed, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. She answered on the second ring, her voice as crisp and clear as I remembered. Margaret Shaw, no pleasantries, just a statement of fact. Margaret, I began, my voice a broken whisper. It's Eleanor. Eleanor Grant. There was a brief pause, and for a horrible second, I thought she wouldn't remember me. Then, her voice softened, just a fraction. Eleanor. My God. It's been too long. Are you all right? You sound awful. The bluntness of it, the lack of pretense, was like a splash of cold water. Tears I hadn't allowed myself to shed began to well in my eyes. I'm not, Margaret. I'm not all right. And then, it all came pouring out. The trip, the porch, the boxes, the note. I recited the words David had written, my voice cracking on the final, brutal phrase. Don't come back, Mom. I told her about the retirement home brochures, the comments about the house being too much for me, the cloying, suffocating concern. I expected sympathy, perhaps pity. What I got was something far more valuable, cold, clear anger. The manipulative little bastards, she said, and the venom in her voice was a strange and powerful balm. Eleanor, listen to me. This isn't just a family dispute. This is calculated. This is strategic. They've been setting this up for months, maybe years. The concern, the helpful suggestions, it's a classic playbook for elder exploitation, cloaked in familial love. The word exploitation struck me like a physical blow. It was an ugly word, a word for newspaper headlines and cautionary tales. It wasn't a word for my family, for my son. But as she said it, a piece of the puzzle clicked into place. It reframed everything. It wasn't that I had failed as a mother, it was that they had succeeded as predators. What do I do, Margaret? I asked, my voice small. I'm in a motel. I have 2 suitcases and a few $100s in my purse. You do not panic, she commanded, her tone shifting from outrage to strategy. First, you are not to contact them. Not a text, not a call. Nothing. Let them stew in their own arrogance. Second, I want you to think. Is there a will? Yours and Robert's? Yes, I whispered. We had one drawn up years ago. Mirror wills. Everything to each other, then everything to David. Where is it? In the study. In the bottom drawer of the mahogany desk. In a blue folder, and the deed to the house. Any other financial documents? Pension information, investment statements. All there, I said. In the same desk, good, she said, a grim satisfaction in her voice. They are arrogant, Eleanor. People like this, they always are. They think they've covered all the bases, but they are so focused on the emotional manipulation that they get sloppy with the paperwork. They are counting on you to be too heartbroken and confused to fight back. Her words were a lifeline. She wasn't just validating my pain, she was giving it a direction. She was turning my grief into a potential weapon. Meet me tomorrow, she said. My office. 10 a.m. I'm retired, but I still keep the space. We'll get a decent coffee, and we will start building a wall around you so high and so strong they'll need a rocket ship to see over it. Are you with me, Eleanor? For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something other than despair. It was small, fragile, but it was there. It was resolve. Yes, I said, my voice firmer than it had been since I'd stepped out of that taxi. Yes, Margaret. I'm with you. After the call with Margaret, the motel room felt different. The anonymous walls were no longer a prison of despair, but a strategic bunker. The silence was no longer a sign of my erasure, but a space for contemplation, for sharpening my mind. Margaret's words, they are counting on you to be too heartbroken and confused to fight back, had lit a pilot light deep within me. It was a flame of quiet, cold fury. They had misjudged me. They saw the accommodating mother, the quiet widow, the gentle gardener. They had forgotten the woman who had sat beside her husband through months of grueling treatments, deciphering complex medical charts and challenging doctors who were too dismissive. They had forgotten the woman who had single-handedly managed the family's finances after a market crash, clawing back their security with careful, painstaking precision. I had allowed that woman to go dormant, to recede into the background for the sake of familial harmony, but she had not died. She had been waiting. I pushed the flimsy motel desk under the window, creating a makeshift workspace. I took a notepad and a pen from my purse, the ones I usually used for grocery lists and garden plans. The first thing I wrote, in firm, clear letters, was facts beneath it. I began to make a list, not of my sorrows, but of my strengths. I listed every asset I could remember, the house, its estimated value, the savings accounts, the small portfolio of stocks Robert had so carefully curated, his pension that had transferred to me. I wrote down dates of conversations, fragments of things David and Sarah had said that now seemed sinister in their intent. The casual question from David about my online banking password, just in case you ever need help, Mom Sarah's offhand remark about how confusing property taxes were, and how she'd be happy to look them over for me. Each memory, once a benign tile in the mosaic of our lives, now revealed itself as part of a different, darker pattern. The act of writing was transformative. It took the swirling chaos in my head and gave it structure. It converted emotion into information. With every line I wrote, I felt a layer of the victim shedding away, replaced by something harder, more resolute. I was no longer just a heartbroken mother. I was the plaintiff in the case of my own life. My thoughts turned to Robert. I closed my eyes and pictured him in his favorite armchair in the study, a book in his lap, the reading light casting a warm glow on his face. He had been a man of quiet integrity. He trusted people, but he was no fool. The foundation of everything, Eleanor, he'd told me once, holding my hand across the dining table, is respect. When that goes, everything built on top of it will crumble. The respect was gone. David and Sarah had not just taken my house, they had fundamentally disrespected my existence, my intelligence, my entire history. They had treated me as an object to be managed and discarded. I was not just fighting for a building of wood and brick. I was fighting for Robert's legacy, for the life we had built together, a life founded on that very principle of mutual respect. I was fighting for the woman he had loved, the woman he had seen as his equal and his partner. A new kind of energy began to flow through me. It wasn't the frantic energy of panic, but the slow, steady hum of purpose. I opened my suitcase and pulled out a simple, elegant navy blue dress, the one I had worn to board meetings when I served on the library's foundation years ago. I hung it on the back of the door, a symbol of the woman I was preparing to become again. I would not meet Margaret in tears. I would not meet her as a victim. I would meet her as a client. I looked at the list on my notepad. It was a declaration of war, written not with anger, but with clarity. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in my chest, but it was no longer my anchor. It was my ballast. It would keep me steady through the storm to come. The quiet matriarch was gone, erased not by her son, but by her own dawning resolve. In her place, a quiet strategist was beginning to emerge, and she was meticulously planning her first move. I went to bed that night and, for the first time in days, I slept soundly, without dreams. The battle had been joined, not in a courtroom or across a dinner table, but in the quiet, resolute chambers of my own heart. The next morning, I dressed with deliberate care. The navy dress felt like armor. Each button fastened was a small act of defiance. When I looked in the mirror, I still saw the lines of grief around my eyes, but for the first time, I also saw a glint of the woman I used to be, the woman Margaret knew. Her office was in a sleek, modern building downtown, a world away from my quiet, tree-lined street. The air here smelled of glass and ambition. Margaret greeted me not with a hug of pity, but with a firm, warm handshake. "Eleanor. You look ready for a fight." Her office was surprisingly personal for such a corporate setting. The walls were lined with books, not just on law, but on history, art, and philosophy. A beautiful, abstract sculpture sat on her wide mahogany desk. She gestured for me to sit, and poured 2 cups of coffee from a silver carafe. It was dark, strong, and bitter, the coffee of people with work to do. "All right," she said, taking a seat opposite me, her gaze direct and assessing. "Tell me everything again. Slowly. Don't leave anything out, no matter how small." I took out my notepad, my list of facts, and began. I spoke calmly, methodically, laying out the timeline of deception as I now understood it. I recounted the conversations, the brochures, the manufactured concern. I described the will in the blue folder, the deed in the desk drawer. Margaret listened without interruption, her fingers steepled under her chin. She made a few brief notes on a yellow legal pad, her pen scratching quietly in the silent room. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on something beyond me. "Okay," she said finally. "It's as I suspected. A classic undue influence campaign. They've built a case for your supposed incompetence, all based on anecdotal evidence and feigned concern. They are banking on the fact that you'd be too emotionally devastated to question the narrative." She leaned forward, her expression sharp. "Now, the will. You said it was a mirror will. Everything to you, and upon your death, everything to David. Is that correct?" "Yes. We wrote them 20 years ago. We never saw a reason to change them. And the house. Whose name is on the deed?" "Both of our names," I said. "Robert and Eleanor Grant. Joint tenants with right of survivorship." I remember the lawyer explaining it very clearly. When he passed, his share automatically became mine. "The house is fully, legally mine." A slow smile spread across Margaret's face. It was not a warm smile, it was the smile of a predator, who has just spotted a fatal weakness in its prey. "And they are so arrogant," she murmured, almost to herself. "They assumed you were a passive beneficiary of your husband's estate. They didn't consider you an active, legal owner in your own right." She stood up and walked over to a bookshelf, pulling down a heavy, leather-bound volume on property law. "They can't sell the house without your signature on the deed transfer. They can't liquidate major marital assets that are solely in your name without your explicit consent. Trying to declare you incompetent and gain power of attorney is a long, ugly, and very public process. They didn't want that. They wanted a quiet coup. They wanted you to go gentle into that good night, signing papers you didn't understand out of a sense of obligation and confusion. She looked directly at me. Their entire plan hinges on one thing, Eleanor, your compliance. They evicted you emotionally and physically, hoping you would simply accept their decree. They wrote a note instead of having a conversation, because they are cowards. And cowards make mistakes, she explained the legal landscape. The note was an emotional weapon, but legally worthless. Their concerns were hearsay. Their only real power would come from me granting it to them. So what do we do? I asked, the coffee cup warm between my hands. We don't react. We act, she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. We don't send angry letters. We don't make tearful phone calls. We do what they did, but legally, and with precision. We will file for an emergency restraining order, preventing them from entering the property or accessing any of your financial accounts. It will be granted, based on your testimony. Then, we will have a process server deliver the papers, along with a formal demand for the immediate return of any personal property removed from the home. We will also include a letter from my office informing them that any further attempt to control your assets will be met with legal action for theft, fraud, and elder abuse. The words were shocking in their severity, but they resonated with a terrifying truth. This will force their hand, Margaret continued. They will have to hire a lawyer. They will be exposed. Their quiet, private takeover will suddenly become a very loud, very public legal battle, and they do not have the facts on their side. All we have are the facts. She closed the heavy law book with a decisive thud that echoed in the quiet room. They threw you out, Eleanor. We are going to legally, quietly, and methodically take it all back. And then, you can decide what you want to do with it. The power was always yours. They just convinced you to set it down for a while. It's time to pick it up again. The days that followed our meeting were a study in quiet diligence. Margaret's office became my new headquarters, a sanctuary of strategy and steel. The first step, as she had outlined, was to secure the emergency restraining order. This required me to write a sworn affidavit, a formal, legal telling of my story. Sitting in a quiet conference room, with a paralegal to guide me, I wrote it all down. This time, it wasn't for my own clarity, it was for a judge. Every memory of David and Sarah's calculated concern, every manipulative suggestion, every dismissive comment about my abilities, it all went onto the page. It was a painful process, like methodically excavating a wound, but with each paragraph, I felt power accruing. I was no longer just remembering, I was testifying. My grief was being forged into evidence. The most difficult part was describing the moment on the porch. Recounting the sight of my life in boxes, the cold finality of my son's note. But as I wrote, I focused not on the pain, but on the facts. The time of day, the chill in the air, the exact wording. I was building a case, not a lament. Margaret read the finished affidavit, her expression unreadable. This is strong, Eleanor, she said quietly. This is more than enough, she was right. The judge granted the temporary order without hesitation. The next step was the quiet war Margaret had promised, the one waged through paperwork and process servers. I spent hours with her, poring over my financial life. We didn't have the original documents from my desk, but in today's world, almost everything leaves a digital trail. We logged into my bank accounts online. Thankfully, David hadn't thought to change the passwords yet. A stunning oversight born of pure arrogance. We printed statements going back 2 years. We found the email he'd sent with the flight details for my gift of a trip. We found the digital brochure for the Serenity Villas retirement community he'd forwarded, with the subject line, "Something to consider, Mom." Each item was a small, quiet nail in the coffin of their narrative. One afternoon, Margaret suggested I call my financial advisor, a man named Mr. Henderson, who had worked with Robert and me for decades. "Just a wellness check," she said. "See what he knows." I made the call from her speakerphone. Mr. Henderson was a kind, gentle man, and he sounded relieved to hear from me. "Eleanor, I was just about to call you. David was in here last week." My blood ran cold. Margaret held up a hand, signaling me to stay calm. "Oh?" I said, my voice remarkably steady. "What about?" "Well," Mr. Henderson said, a note of discomfort in his voice, "he was asking about the process for establishing a power of attorney. He said you'd been getting a bit forgetful, and that he wanted to be prepared to help you manage things if need be. He wanted to know what forms would be required." Margaret caught my eye, a glint of triumph in her gaze. It was the smoking gun. "And what did you tell him, Mr. Henderson?" I asked. "I told him, of course, that you would need to be present and sign any such documents in front of a notary, and that I would need to speak with you privately to ensure you were not under any duress." He seemed disappointed with that answer. Said he was just trying to be proactive. "Thank you for your diligence, Mr. Henderson," I said, a wave of gratitude washing over me. "I appreciate you looking out for my best interests." After the call, Margaret leaned back in her chair. "They were trying to bypass you entirely. Find a friendly banker, or a notary, who wasn't paying attention. But they underestimated the old guard, the people who actually knew you and Robert." The evidence was piling up. The affidavit, the bank statements, the emails, the testimony from my financial advisor. It was a fortress of facts, just as Margaret had promised. We were not just defending against their attack, we were building an unassailable case for their malicious intent. The final piece was the process server. A stranger, hired to deliver the cold, hard truth to my son's doorstep, my former doorstep. Margaret handed me the package of documents to look over one last time. The restraining order, the demand for property, the stern letter from her firm. Holding the thick envelope felt heavy, final. This was the point of no return. This was the quiet declaration that the mother he thought he could discard was now a force he would have to reckon with. I thought of David as a little boy, trusting and open. The pain of that memory was sharp, a deep, internal ache. But then I thought of the note, of the cold calculation in his eyes, and the pain hardened into resolve. "It's time," I said to Margaret, my voice clear and steady. "Let them know I'm not gone. I'm just getting started." The silence that followed the delivery of the legal documents was a different kind of silence than the one I had endured in the motel room. That had been a silence of shock and erasure. This was a silence of strategy, a silence charged with tension and the anticipation of a response. It was the quiet before the storm, but this time, I was the one who had seeded the clouds. I had moved from the motel to a small, furnished apartment Margaret had found for me, a clean, bright space with a view of the city park. It felt temporary, but it was mine. A refuge I had secured for myself. Here, I began the slow work of rebuilding a routine. I bought groceries. I walked in the park. I sat by the window and read, not for escape, but for fortification. Every mundane act felt like a reclamation of my independence. My phone, which had been a source of dread, now sat on the kitchen counter, an object of detached curiosity. I knew it would ring. It was not a matter of if, but when. The call came 4 days after the papers were served. It was an unfamiliar number. I let it ring twice, took a deep, steadying breath, and answered. "Hello, Mom." David's voice was tight, strained, stripped of its usual smooth confidence. It was the voice of a man who had just been checked in a game he thought he was winning effortlessly. "We need to talk." "There's nothing for us to talk about, David," I said, my voice cool and even. I was proud of how calm I sounded. Margaret had coached me for this moment. "Keep it short. State your position. Do not engage. My lawyer is Margaret Shaw." any communication should go through her office, a lawyer. Mom, this is a family matter. Why would you involve lawyers? The indignation in his voice was breathtaking. He, who had evicted his own mother with a note, was now offended by the formality of the law. The irony was so bitter it almost made me laugh. You made it a legal matter, David, when you locked me out of my home and disposed of my property, I said. The word property hung in the air between us. It was a cold, hard word, the word he and Sarah had been using in their own private calculations. Hearing it from me was clearly a shock. We were just trying to help, he insisted, his voice rising. You weren't coping. The house is too much. We were worried. Your concern has been noted, I said, echoing a phrase I had heard Margaret use. If you have anything further to say, please direct it to Ms. Shaw. I could hear Sarah's voice in the background, a sharp, urgent whisper. He was clearly on speakerphone. Mom, listen, David said, his tone shifting, attempting to regain the old dynamic of the reasonable son managing his emotional mother. Sarah and I, we want to see you. We need to clear this up. Face to face, this was the moment Margaret had predicted. They would try to get me in a room alone, to use our shared history, the weight of my motherhood, against me. They would try to manipulate, to cajole, to guilt me back into submission. A meeting can be arranged, I said, my voice unwavering. At Ms. Shaw's office. She will be present. You may bring your legal counsel. There was a sputtering sound on the other end of the line. We don't have legal counsel. This is absurd. Then I suggest you acquire one, I said, and with a steadiness that surprised even myself, I ended the call. I placed the phone back on the counter, my hand perfectly still. The first move had been made. The first exchange was over. I had not broken. I had not wept. I had not yelled. I had simply stated the new terms of our engagement. I had held my ground. A few hours later, Margaret called. They are panicking, she said, a note of grim satisfaction in her voice. A lawyer by the name of Stephen Finch called me this afternoon. A bottom feeder, who specializes in quick, messy settlements. He said his clients, the Grants, were deeply distressed by the misunderstanding, and wanted to arrange a mediation to heal the familial rift. What did you tell him? I asked. I told him his clients had 1 week to return every single item of your personal property to a secure storage unit, the key to which would be delivered to my office. And that after that was completed, we would be willing to discuss the orderly transfer of the real estate back to its rightful owner. I believe the phrase I used was unconditional surrender. The audacity of it made me gasp, but it was followed by a wave of profound relief. I had an advocate. A champion. For the first time in so long, I was not alone in my fight. I was part of a we that was strong, strategic, and utterly unintimidated. The quiet war of paperwork was escalating, and the first resounding shot had been fired directly from my own calm, resolute voice. The day of the meeting arrived cloaked in a cold, persistent drizzle that matched the mood of the occasion. The conference room at Margaret's firm felt like neutral territory, a demilitarized zone. The long, polished table reflected the grey light from the large window. I sat on one side with Margaret. The chairs opposite us were empty. We waited. I felt a tremor of the old anxiety, the conditioned instinct to smooth things over, to make peace. But then I looked at Margaret, her expression calm and unyielding, and I felt my own resolve harden. I was not here to make peace. I was here to accept the terms of their surrender. David and Sarah arrived exactly 7 minutes late, a small, transparent power play that Margaret completely ignored. She didn't even look up from her notes until they were seated. With them was their lawyer, Stephen Finch, a man whose suit seemed a size too big for him, as if he had been hastily dressed for an occasion beyond his usual scope. David looked pale and thinner, the confident sheen he usually wore completely gone. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at a point on the wall just over my left shoulder. Sarah, however, was a different story. Her posture was rigid, her face a mask of polite fury. Her gaze met mine, and it was filled with a cold, undisguised resentment. She was the strategist, and her plan had failed. This was her defeat. Mr. Finch cleared his throat, shuffling his papers noisily. "Well," he began, with an attempt at breezy cordiality that fell flat in the tense room. "We are all here to, resolve this unfortunate misunderstanding. My clients, David and Sarah Grant, have always acted out of love and concern for their mother." Margaret let the silence hang in the air for a full 10 seconds before she spoke. "Mr. Finch," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Let's dispense with the fiction. We are not here to discuss emotions. We are here to discuss the illegal eviction of my client from her legal residence, and the theft of her personal assets. Let's begin there." Sarah bristled, opening her mouth to speak, but her lawyer placed a restraining hand on her arm. David flinched as if he'd been struck. They were not prepared for this. They had expected a tearful family drama, not a clinical legal dissection. I remained silent, a conscious choice. My power in this room was in my stillness, in my refusal to engage in the emotional theater they had written for me. I was not the hysterical mother. I was the injured party, represented by counsel. I was a fact they could no longer ignore. My clients, Mr. Finch stammered, were merely trying to secure the property and Mrs. Grant's belongings while she was away, in preparation for a discussion about her future care, a discussion that began with a note on her porch telling her not to return. Margaret countered, raising a single, skeptical eyebrow. An interesting conversational gambit. She slid a photograph across the polished table. It was a picture of the boxes and the note, taken by the process server. The image lay between us, a stark, undeniable testament to their actions. David finally looked at it, and a flicker of something, shame, perhaps, or just the horror of being caught, crossed his face. "We have your client's sworn affidavit," Margaret continued, her tone relentlessly calm. "We have the testimony of her financial advisor regarding your son's inquiries into gaining power of attorney. We have emails. We have a clear and demonstrable pattern of behavior intended to manipulate Mrs. Grant and seize control of her assets. The legal term for this, Mr. Finch, is elder abuse. It carries significant civil and criminal penalties. Are you familiar with them?" Their lawyer's face paled. Sarah shot a venomous glare at David, a silent, furious, "I told you this was a mistake." It was then that I decided to speak. My voice, when it came, was low and steady, devoid of the tremor I felt inside. I looked directly at my son, forcing him to meet my gaze. "David," I said. Just his name. It was not a plea. It was a summons. He finally looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw not a monster, but a weak man who had taken a path of profound moral cowardice, led by the ambition of his wife. "There was a time," I said, "when if you had a problem, or if you were worried about me, you would have come to me. You would have sat at my kitchen table, and we would have talked. You would have trusted me to be a part of my own life's decisions." I let the words sink in. "You chose not to do that. You and Sarah made a choice. You chose deception instead of conversation. You chose to treat me as a problem to be managed, not as a person to be respected. This," I said, gesturing to the lawyers and the sterile room, "is the consequence of that choice. Not of my actions, but of yours." I leaned back in my chair. I had said what needed to be said. There was no anger in my voice, only a deep, resonant sadness, and an unshakable finality. The narrative was no longer theirs to control. I had reclaimed it. The silence that followed was their defeat. Sarah stared down at the table, her mask of composure finally cracking. David looked utterly broken. They had come here hoping to manage a situation, and they had been confronted with the truth of their own character. The quiet confrontation was over. There was no shouting, no dramatic confessions. There was only the cold, hard weight of their actions, laid bare on a polished table under a grey, unforgiving sky. The aftermath of the meeting was swift and decisive. Faced with the undeniable evidence and the threat of a public, humiliating court battle, David and Sarah capitulated completely. Their lawyer, eager to cut his losses, advised them to agree to all of our terms. Within a week, the key to a climate-controlled storage unit was delivered to Margaret's office. I went there alone. Seeing my life catalogued and stored under the fluorescent lights of a windowless facility was a strange, disembodying experience. There was the chipped ceramic robin, the box of old photographs, my gardening tools, my books. They were just things, but they were my things, artifacts of a life they had tried to archive and erase. I walked through the unit, touching nothing. The legal transfer of the house back into my sole, uncontested control took another few weeks. The day Margaret called to tell me it was done, that the deed was clean and the title was clear, I felt not a surge of triumph, but a quiet, hollow ache. I had won. I had my house back. But what did that victory mean? I couldn't imagine living there again. The memory of the dark porch light, the boxes, the note, it was etched into the very framework of the house now. The ghosts of their betrayal would walk every hall. The kitchen where I'd baked pies would forever smell of their deception. It was no longer a sanctuary, it was a monument to a deep and painful wound. For days, I wrestled with what to do. The house represented everything Robert and I had worked for. It was our legacy. But what is a legacy if it brings only pain? One evening, sitting in my small, clean apartment, watching the city lights flicker on in the park below, an idea began to form. It started as a whisper, a radical thought that went against every instinct of holding on, of preserving the past. What if the legacy wasn't the house itself? What if the legacy was the lesson? The next morning, I called Margaret. "I'm selling the house," I said, without preamble. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Eleanor," she said carefully. "Are you sure? You fought so hard for it." "I fought for my right to choose, Margaret," I replied, a clarity in my voice that felt new and powerful. "Not for the building itself. And I'm choosing to let it go. But I'm not just going to walk away," I explained my idea, the one that had crystallized in the quiet of the night. I didn't just want to sell the house and live off the proceeds. I wanted to transform its value, its meaning. I wanted to take the capital from this painful chapter of my life and turn it into a force for good. I would use a significant portion of the money from the sale to establish a foundation. A small one, to start, but a meaningful one. The Robert and Eleanor Grant Foundation for Elder Justice. Its mission would be simple: to provide pro bono legal advice and representation for elderly individuals facing situations like mine. For the ones who didn't have a Margaret Shaw to call. For the ones who were being quietly managed and manipulated into giving up their homes, their savings, their autonomy. Margaret was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "Eleanor Grant," she said softly. "That is the most elegant, powerful, and downright brilliant act of quiet revenge I have ever had the privilege to witness. My personal struggle, my private pain, would become a public shield for others. The house Robert and I built with love would be transformed into a legacy of protection. The betrayal I suffered would fuel a fight for the dignity of others. This was the true victory. It wasn't about getting my house back. It was about defining what home truly meant. It wasn't a place. It was security. It was dignity. It was the right to write your own story, right to the very end. The final documents I signed were not ones of surrender, but of creation. I sold the house to a young family with 2 small children. I watched from my apartment window as their moving truck pulled up, as they carried their own boxes, filled with their own dreams, up the front steps. They turned on the porch light, and its warm glow felt like a benediction, a release. My legacy was no longer in those walls. It was just beginning. My new life is quieter than my old one, but it is a silence of my own choosing. It is the silence of a sunlit morning in my small cottage by the sea, the one I bought with a portion of the proceeds from the sale of the house. It is a home that fits me perfectly, with no extra rooms to hold ghosts. The air here smells of salt and roses from the small garden I have started to cultivate. My days are structured not by the needs of others, but by my own rhythms. I wake with the sun. I walk on the beach, collecting sea glass and watching the tide ebb and flow, a constant, soothing reminder that everything changes. I volunteer twice a week at the local library, surrounded by the comforting scent of old paper and the quiet hum of people lost in stories. My work with the foundation is the anchor of my new existence. I am not a lawyer, but I am a founder. I am a voice. I sit on the board with Margaret, who serves as its chair, and a handful of other passionate, dedicated people. My role is to read the stories that come in, the letters and emails from people who feel lost and invisible, just as I once did. I am the first line of empathy. I listen to their stories of helpful children and concerned relatives, and I hear the echoes of my own. I can tell them, with an authority born of experience, you are not crazy. You are not alone. And you have the right to fight back. We have helped a dozen families in our first year. We helped a retired school teacher in Ohio, whose nephew tried to have her declared incompetent to sell off her farmland. We helped a widower in Florida, whose daughter was siphoning his pension, telling him he was no good with numbers anymore. Each small victory is a quiet affirmation of the choice I made. My son, David, has tried to reach out a few times. A card on my birthday. A short, stilted email. He talks about his new job, the weather. He never mentions what happened. He never apologizes. It is as if he is trying to rebuild a bridge over a canyon of his own making, without ever acknowledging the canyon exists. I do not write back. It is not out of spite, but out of a deep understanding that forgiveness without accountability is just another form of erasure. He must live with the choices he made. And I must live with mine. I have chosen peace. I have chosen purpose. I have found a new kind of family in the faces of the people we help, in the fierce loyalty of my friend Margaret, in the community I have built here by the sea. Sometimes, in the evening, I sit on my small porch, a cup of tea in my hand, and watch the lighthouse at the point begin its steady, sweeping rhythm. Light, then dark, then light again. It is a promise, just like Robert's porch light once was. But this promise is different. It is not about a home waiting for me. It is a promise I have made to myself. That I will be a beacon. That even after the deepest darkness, it is possible to find your own light and shine it for others. Have you ever felt erased, only to realize you were simply being given a blank page? A chance to rewrite your own story, in your own words, on your own terms. It is a terrifying and wondrous thing, to become the author of your own life, especially when you thought the final chapter had already been written for you. My story is not about loss. It is about retrieval. Not the retrieval of a house, but the retrieval of a self. And that is a home that no one can ever take away from you.